Well, good morning. My name's Todd Holmes. I'm with the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce our sixth and final panel of the conference. Usually, some moderators follow it, some don't, but I usually like to go with the rule of brevity when you're introducing, because if I was expected or people really wanted to hear me speak, I'd actually be sitting among the panelists, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce them, and we can get this started. The panel on public lands and natural resources, this is a topic that we've touched on ever since Thursday night with David Kennedy's talk, all throughout many times yesterday. So I'm very excited that we have a panel of esteemed scholars who are going to shed some more light on this and open it up for a very interesting discussion. Joining us today, we have Patrick Shea, who is a professor of biology at the University of Utah. He's also a private attorney in Salt Lake City. And to add further to a very impressive resume, he has actually worked in policy in a number of positions. Most directly related to our discussion today, he was the director of the Bureau of Land Management under the Clinton administration. Also joining us is Martha Williams. She is the assistant professor at the Alexander Bluet School of Law here at the University of Montana, and she's also the co-director of the Land Use and Natural Resource Clinic. We also have Nicola Ulibarri. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford, and this fall will be joining the faculty in the Department of Planning, Policy, and Design at UC Irvine. And last but not least, we have Tay Wiles, who is the editor, reporter, and journalist extraordinaire for High Country News out of Colorado. So please let me join me in welcoming him to this panel. Research says clapping makes you happy and gets you interested, so that's why I want to do that. Patrick, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm technologically challenged, so on the wall there's a old-fashioned map of Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota. If you have a chance to look at it, it shows the mineral estates that BLM is responsible for in Montana. According to the Congressional Research Office, the federal government owns 640 million acres of surface area, or 28% of the 2.2 billion acres in the United States. The BLM manages approximately 265 million, and I did put up this title, again, Not Eaten in 1729, when Jonathan Swift wrote his memorable essay about how to deal with the Irish problem. We do have, back to 1790, this is how the United States looked. I want to point out, and we will have, with Jeff's help a little bit later, more graphic presentation in the West. But the Forest Service has responsibility for 193 million acres, mostly in the western United States. Fish and Wildlife Service has 150 million acres, again, mostly in the western United States. National Parks has 84.9 million acres, 55 million acres of which are in Alaska. And just so you have some idea of acreage, the state of New York is 80 million acres. So you get some senses of size. Now, one of the little-known facts is that BLM is responsible for 700 million acres of underground estate. And so a lot of the discussion about transferring federal lands to the state focuses mostly on the surface estate, not on the subsurface estate. And there are various congressional acts which tell the various federal agencies how those should be taken care of. And really beginning in 1872 with the Mining Act, which was written by a gold miner from Nevada who was a United States Senator, more attention has been paid, in my judgment, to how there could be private exploitation of those public assets, and there have been about how they could be managed from a public point of view. But in 1870, after the Civil War, Horace Mann and John Wesley Powell and other intellectuals at the time said, with all this vast acreage, any benefit from that vast acreage should be devoted solely to education. And not surprisingly, between then, 1870, and now, much of that original intent has been forgotten. Beginning really in the late 1970s with New Mexico leading the way, there was an increased awareness of the fiduciary duty, and so there began to be much greater attention paid. But we are still plagued with this incredibly crazy checkerboard square pattern where nobody can manage those lands in a coherent fashion just because of the checkerboard nature. Now, as I mentioned, there was this altruistic dedication to education, but not surprisingly, first with the railroads, then the oil and gas companies and the mining companies, they were more than happy to develop those lands for private benefit, but they did not necessarily rigorously pay the royalties that were due either to the United States or to the federal government or to the state governments. So how did we get there? Originally with the 13 states, as you can see here, the eastern boundary was quite clearly defined by the seashore, but the western boundary, the western frontier, was not quite as well known. So Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and James Madison each had had some exposure to France, where there was this marvelous invention of the sextant and the ability to map out with a great deal of precision what surface areas should be bounded by. And so they began to do that, and one of the first federal agencies created was the General Land Office. And this is a lesson that we need to understand, because once you had public land available, somehow mysteriously for $50,000, 30 million acres were bought by private individuals. And our first land scandal, the Yazoo land scandal in Georgia, happened, and there were people who were convicted because they bought it for $50,000 and immediately flipped it into selling it for much more. When the Founding Fathers found this out, they were quite upset. There were prosecutions for having done this, and I would suggest to you that that's not an isolated activity. They did have, right after the Grant administration, a similar scandal involving General or President Grant's brother-in-law, Secretary of Interior Columbus Delano, and he was taking bribes for fraudulent land grants. This was how the United States looked in 1810, the Louisiana Purchase, and then the Oregon Country, and then eventually in 1848, the acquisition of what had been the Spanish and then Mexican empire. By 1900, the states had been more or less formed. There was still Arizona, New Mexico, and part of Oklahoma. And you'll recall the Oklahoma land rush was the last real allocation in a sizable way. But from 1875, almost every 10 years, there was a major land scandal. In 1946, for instance, the Texas legislature passed the Veterans Land Act, and there was $24 million in bonds allocated. There was a scandal where a businessman were paying Hispanic and African American veterans to sign up for these land grants for $7,500 loans, and then they got nothing for having done that. They too were indicted. Now, I won't recite each of the innumerable scandals, but one can easily believe that there has not been a single decade in the 2.5 centuries of the United States government that there has not been a land scandal. And indeed, when I became director of BLM, there were 4 BLM employees under federal investigation for land transactions in Nevada and California, where on the day of the transaction, the appraised value was $500 an acre, and then mysteriously, 2 days later, when a bank loan was applied for, the value per acre was $10,000. So we created a national office of appraisal to slow that down. So what's my solution? And I really do appreciate the Eccles family having put together this conference, and Bruce and his staff from the Lane Center putting it together. But one of the things that I keep wanting to come back to is, let's talk about solutions. let's talk not necessarily about data, but what can we do on a go-forward basis. So I have my modest proposal. First, the states with significant federal land holdings should be allowed to manage portions of those federal lands as long as they maintain federal standards for administration of those plans. That is the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Acts, and regulations which follow from them would be enforced by the states but subject to audits by the federal government. Number two, certain lands, those within 10 miles of the center line of any major water body, lake, reservoir, river, or stream, would remain the exclusive province of the federal government. It is these areas that have the sensitive biota that reside there and therefore need more careful management than the states would provide or could offer to provide. Number three, and this is an important point that is often forgotten in this whole land transfer question, the subsurface area of 700 million acres would be available for management by the states, provided, again, that federal standards were met and agreed to, and there were a structured royalty payment for the federal government and for state governments, provided it was devoted exclusively for the benefit of educational programs in the state and in the federal government, going back to the original purpose in 1870. Now, some critics of this modest proposal might say that there's no basis today of calculating what the value would be, but oil and gas companies and mining companies that I've represented have solved this problem, much like the Portuguese did in the 16th century when they would send off these adventurers like Christopher Columbus, and they would allocate first the expenses to be deducted, and then if it returned, the allocation of royalties. So there was a future allocation that was very important, and I think you could do that. So those 3 points need to be introduced in the sometimes schizophrenic dialogue about the transferring of public lands. We don't transfer public lands. In my judgment, we transfer stewardship, and the stewardship has to be based on what's best for the country, not for a particular region. Now, one last point, and this is quite relevant to our discussions here over the last 2.5 days. Any political issue must be viewed in context, and many here today who have made their livelihood ranching or farming know day in and day out the difficulties they face. But most of the problems revolve around economics, and not surprisingly, economic dilemmas may be defined in different terms, some locally, some regionally, and some nationally. But one common problem we are all facing is the inequitable distribution of capital wealth. After World War I, the Roaring '20s had a similar inequitable distribution of wealth, and it brought about a New Deal. Maybe it's time that we look for a new arrangement. For instance, why should it be a matter of national security that small ranching or agricultural operations, say smaller than 600 acres, be eligible for tax benefits in the form of credits for maintaining their operation as a food source for food security, so the rest of us consumers don't continue to become ever more dependent on the agribusiness which grows crops and raises livestock 2,000 or 3,000 miles away from where it is consumed. At the end of the day, it's my belief that America, particularly rural America, must protect our tradition, both because they are our heritage, but in a more unrecognized way, they are our food security. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for sticking it out to the end. Can I get the? So today I'm also going to be focusing more on a solution than necessarily a problem. And that is to talk specifically about the role that collaborative decision-making can play for managing our resources. And so collaborative governance is essentially when you have public agencies, so this can be federal governments, local governments, anywhere in between, working jointly with people who directly depend on these resources, local users, nonprofit organizations, tribes, to jointly decide how these resources should be managed. And because collaboration is seen as a potential way to overcome a lot of the conflicts that have been so inherent in much of our land and resource management, it's grown a lot in popularity in recent years, so much so that there are actually quite a few agencies that are now mandating some level of collaborative engagement for most of their planning and policy processes. And much of what my research has looked at is trying to understand, well, so what? You know, is all of this collaborative engagement worth it? Does collaboration actually enhance the management of the resources that we're trying to value? And what I want to share today is a few thoughts based on that research, specifically coming out of a process for licensing hydropower facilities here in the U.S. And hydropower, you know, it might seem, okay, that's kind of a niche thing, but hydropower has characteristics of a lot of the public resources that we're dealing with, because it sits at the nexus of a lot of different things that we as a society care about. So on the one hand, you have the actual electrical generation capabilities of a hydropower dam. Hydropower is renewable, low greenhouse gas emission, so it's an important part of a lot of portfolios, particularly out here in the western U.S. But the decision to build and operate a dam affects a lot of other things, like aquatic habitat, for instance. So because you're changing the timing and amount of water that's in the river below the dam, you're affecting water quality, you're affecting temperature, you're affecting flow rates, all things that affect what kinds of species can live there. And anybody from the Columbia River Basin where we are here probably knows too that it's particularly important when you build a dam, you can cut off large portions of the historic range of migratory species like these salmon. It affects recreational access. So on the one hand, out here in the West, a lot of the lake surfaces we have are actually reservoirs. So they're not there naturally, but they're super important for activities like sailing, like jet skiing, like houseboating. But again, because you're changing the timing and rate of water that's in the river downstream, you're affecting other recreational activities like whitewater rafting and kayaking or river-based fisheries. Plus, a lot of these dams and reservoirs are located on or near publicly held lands. Forest Service properties, national parks, BLM lands. So again, we have to make sure that these hydropower facilities are being managed in concert with the goals of those larger properties. So given this sort of complex feature, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which oversees all non-federally owned dams, is required to balance the power values of a dam with all of these other non-power values when they decide whether or not to license a dam. And to do that, they encourage electrical utilities, whoever the dam owners are, to collaborate with federal and state resource agencies, with tribes, with local governments, to decide, okay, well, how do we think that this particular hydropower facility should be run? And today, I just want to share 2 short vignettes of what this collaborative process can look like to think about, okay, well, what can collaboration do for managing our resources? The first is coming out of Baker Lake in Washington State, so it's in the Puget Sound area. And this is one of the highest collaboration cases that I have looked at. And in this relicensing process, pretty much every decision was made jointly by a very diverse set of stakeholders. This is little decisions like how frequently they wanted to meet, to the big decisions like whether to manage for flood control. And they achieved this through a very ongoing process of dialogue and deliberation. So they would meet fairly regularly, multiple times per month. And they're actually still meeting today. The license has been out for several years, but they're still meeting to implement the license, I think, on monthly basis at this point. But basically at these meetings, there will be some idea on the table. Okay, let's say maybe increasing flows for whitewater rafting. And when that idea is discussed, there's a chance for everybody to chime in and think about, well, how will that particular decision affect the resources that I care about? And are there any potential conflicts that I see? So maybe if we're talking about whitewater rafting, a fish biologist could speak up and say, you know, it's particularly important that we not try to hold these whitewater events when there are a bunch of juvenile fish in the river, for instance. And so they can try to manage for a lot of different resources at once, but trying not to make sure that there are conflicts. And what this means then is that the license that was ultimately developed for the Baker project was a very complicated license, but it managed for pretty much every single interest that was in that room. And it meant that the license itself really then balanced between all of these competing interests and met many different benefits. So the second vignette that I want to give is coming out of an ongoing process in the foothills of the Sierras in the California Central Valley. And in this process, it's again a very collaborative sort of co-deliberation process. But it's centered around the use of computer-based simulation models. And so what this process looked like was the models themselves were built by two engineering consultants who were hired by the electrical utilities. But as the models were being developed, they were very iteratively tested out with that stakeholder group. So again, meeting almost monthly. And the consultants would share, okay, here's the latest updates to the model. Here are the assumptions that we're making. And really trying to understand, did those assumptions make sense to everybody in the room? As well as a chance to educate all of the stakeholders about how this fairly complicated model worked. So what that means then is that now that the model is actually being used to test out potential solutions, the stakeholders understand how the model works and what assumptions and conclusions can be drawn from the model and what can't be drawn. But more importantly, they trust what the model is saying, and they trust what the consultants are saying, the consultants who are the ones who are actually running this model. And so since that model's been developed, they're using it to sort of hone in on these management solutions. And they'll come up with, for instance, a goal. We want to make sure that we don't want to go above a particular temperature threshold, which can be lethal to fish. So they'll say, okay, well, what can happen? Let's try running 60% of the inflow through the river for a month. See what happens. And so they can see, okay, what happened to the temperature? Great, we didn't meet our temperature threshold, so that's good. But then they can also test out and see, okay, are the boat ramps still in the water? Yes or no? How much was the hit to electricity? What was the hit to irrigation deliveries? So they're able to make sure that any solution that they come up with is trying to balance, again, between all of those various interests. Now, I don't want to say that collaboration is the be-all, end-all solution. It's really, really difficult to do well. It takes a lot of time and resources. And as we've heard over and over and over again, people in rural communities often don't have those times and resources. It also requires that all of the participants be willing to engage. It's particularly important that, obviously, the electrical utility be open to including a diverse set of stakeholders in their conversations. But everybody else has to want to be at that table too, and to trust one another to make decisions that in the end will be better for the public. And this can be particularly challenging in places where you have long and very entrenched historical conflicts over how these resources should be managed. But I do think, however, that it's worth it. And so because so many of the conflicts that we are seeing over resource management are sort of right now being framed as either or, that if we can try to come up with solutions that really are multi-benefit and really do balance between these very diverse interests, that will be a better way forward for our communities. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tay Wiles. I'm a reporter and editor with High Country News. No. Thanks for having me, and thanks, Jeff, for having me as a media fellow at the Bill Lane Center. I'm going to talk a little bit about our process at High Country News and how we think about public land stories. And in particular, some events that are related to the Malheur occupation and also the Bundy Ranch standoff in 2014. I'm going to talk about some of my reporting on those topics and how my thinking evolved on those, and then also how those events can be seen as departures from Sagebrush Rebellion events in the past. So in the reporting and editing process, once we get beyond what is happening on the ground, we ask ourselves a number of questions such as, why is it happening? A lot of these questions are probably not unlike the academic process, but another question that we ask ourselves is, what is the physical history of this place? What's the long view? So how do these events fit into historic trends, or how do they buck those trends? Also, how can the individual local experience help us understand the story in ways that experts or other outside observers can't? And how can we report with compassion for that local experience? Also, at every step of the way, we try to answer the question, what does this mean? So how will it impact the lives of our readers or Westerners? When we first see the flicker of a story or a trend that could become a story, we ask, okay, do we know what this means? And then after the reporting process, once we start editing, we ask the same question. We have a little more information at hand, can we answer that? But sometimes it's not until after the story has been published, maybe 6 months or a year later, that what it really means starts to come into better focus. My own path of inquiry on these subjects of public land disputes started when former senior editor Ray Ring, who's from here in Montana, did a story called Diffuse the West, in which he filed a bunch of Freedom of Information Act requests to try to document harassment and threats towards public land employees, so BLM and Forest Service employees, by members of the public. So I thought this was a really interesting story, and as someone who is new to public lands reporting, it answered for me part of what was happening on the ground, but I wanted to know more about why. So 6 months later after that story, this was last April, I attended and reported on an event at Bundy Ranch near Bunkerville, Nevada. There was an anniversary to the standoff that had happened a year prior. And this event was about 3 days of people hanging out, playing music, making speeches, and talking to each other. So it was basically a networking event, similar to this in some ways. So after talking to dozens of people there, one of the first things that really struck me was most of these people weren't locals and they weren't ranchers. They didn't make a living off the public rangelands. And yet the theme of the event was to support these American cowboys, the Bundys. So that point, that there's this additional stakeholder in these public land disputes. And as we have seen, many of them turn out to be these far-flung militia members or members of the Patriot movement. It now may seem obvious since Malheur happened, but it's important to keep in mind that this is actually a relatively new development for public lands. So at that time last year when I was in Bunkerville, the fact that the people who attended were a separate set from the Bundys really stuck with me and came up again in my reporting later that year, last fall. So last fall I was working on a story about the self-described patriot group, the Oath Keepers, in southern Oregon, so Josephine County, Oregon. The Oath Keepers are a national group that were founded in 2008 or 2009. It's mostly former military and law enforcement who, one of their core tenets is to defend the Constitution from domestic and foreign threats. And they have a local chapter in Josephine County, Oregon. The core of my story was about a dispute between two gold miners in that county and the Bureau of Land Management about how they were using their surface rights. So these two miners, once the BLM filed a notice of noncompliance, the miners went to the local chapter of Oath Keepers and asked them for help, and asked them to help defend their mining claim. So the Oath Keepers agreed, and they ultimately turned it into a major national news event. I don't know if people remember. It's Sugar Pine Mine, the Sugar Pine group of mines. And reportedly, someone in the Oath Keepers told me that reportedly 700 people had come through at one time or another during that month and a half. The Oath Keepers created a sort of one-sided standoff in which they were protecting these mining claims from the BLM, which of course said there's no way that they would go in there and try to kick these people off their land. So mining disputes obviously happen all the time, but this one really, really took off, that Sugar Pine Mine, which ended up setting the stage for Malheur in many ways, as many of the same people were involved in both disputes. But when we think about how these things fit into the larger context, it was pretty clear that Sugar Pine Mine fit into a couple of existing narratives. So it fit into the larger Sagebrush Rebellion, in which the miners were playing the part of the rebels, going head-to-head with the federal government. It was also clear that Josephine County was one of many counties westwide that is economically hurting from the compounded effects of the recession and a disappearing extractive industry. And in the case of Josephine County, that's timber. So it fit into these two existing narratives. But in my reporting, I started noticing that many of these events actually didn't quite fit with previous Sagebrush Rebellion events from those that I'd read about or heard about in decades past, namely the early 1980s and in the 1990s as well. So in former Sagebrush Rebellion events, of course, they seem to be organized by and for livestock ranchers in the interior West and the politicians who supported them. Sometimes a larger group would rally around them, and they were certainly driven by some West-wide attitudes and belief systems, but relatively speaking, those were localized events. Today, land users like these miners and these ranchers that I reported on, who are in disagreement with the federal government, have the option to call on a far-reaching network of members of the Patriot movement who are connected on the internet and can be mobilized immediately. So what we're seeing is this mutually beneficial relationship in which the American cowboy idea is used to further the Patriot movement agenda. And likewise, Sagebrush rebels are able to recruit Patriot movement members in their cause, which of course revolves around control of public lands, water, how we should manage for wildlife, and so on. One last on-the-ground example I'd like to mention that really stuck with me was recorded and put on YouTube and was a cattlemen's meeting in Southern Oregon last fall. Lavoy Finnegan, the man who was shot and killed in the confrontation with the Oregon State Police and the FBI during the Malheur occupation, facilitated much of this meeting in southern Utah last fall. There was also a man there who was head of a militia group in Arizona and many local ranchers. And the point of the meeting was for militia members to come to the ranchers and explain to them what they stand for, what their militia was, and then offer their services to the ranchers. The militia members also were encouraging the ranchers to, quote, take a stand, not pay their federal grazing fees, and the idea was that if they ran into trouble, they would have backup. So I just thought that was a really interesting example of this new relationship that we've seen being forged on the ground. So one of the consequences of the added element of the Patriot movement members in public land disputes is that it makes the whole conversation around public land a little off-kilter because it becomes one step removed from the actual land or the natural resource in the community. The conversation becomes ungrounded from the real beef between the ranchers or the miners and the federal government. While there are creative collaborations happening around the West to find common ground between conservationists, bureaucrats, and ranchers, a new ideological element has been thrown into the mix. There's a new set of people involved. And because of that, these events will probably require new types of solutions to solve, or at least renewed vigor in finding common ground before they reach a fever pitch that results in a major insurgency like Malheur or something yet to come. Thanks.
I feel lucky or not lucky to go last, to get to pull together all these interesting arguments, but they're also a hard acts to follow. So I'm truly honored to be here among this large group of people who truly care about rural issues in the West. It's exciting for us to get to focus and shed light on these issues that we all care about, but from so many different perspectives. So thank you to the Eccles family and the Billings Center for the American West for pulling us all together to have this conversation. So I read the goal of this panel to offer perspectives on the past, present, and future of public lands and natural resource management in the rural Rocky Mountain West. And Pat did a wonderful job of giving that historical perspective and future perspective. And then both Nicola and Tay gave a great example of the present, I think, and future of where we can go. So where do I add in? My perspective as a fairly new law professor, I teach public lands and resources law, wildlife law, introduction to environmental law, and I supervise a clinic. My perspective is always, what do the students need? What seeds do we want to plant in the students who are our future leaders, who are going to be solving these problems for us? What's going to make them effective? What's the best compliment they can get? And I think that compliment is they get it. They understand the issues. So I'm constantly thinking in terms of what to pass on to the students. What do they need to understand? And I think of three things that our future leaders need. One, they absolutely need to understand the story behind the West. That story and that narrative is crucial to understanding even the legal framework. So Pat, I think, did a great job of providing that. Two, I think they need to understand that in order that the major legislation that we've seen, federal legislation, state legislation, is the result of some catalyst. It's the result of a perceived problem or a real problem. That's what pushes the legislative agenda. And then third, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, plus now a social media overreaction. So to recognize when we're looking at federal land management agencies, when we're looking at actions that our decision makers enact, don't forget that there will be a long-standing reaction. So an example of that, I think, and I wasn't sure whether Pat would bring this up, is the establishment in the waning hours of the Clinton administration of the Grand Staircase Escalante Monument. So on one hand, it seemed like it was a monumental decision, huge victory for some. What was the reaction? It rekindled this long, simmering resentment of federal land ownership that I think we are still very much dealing with in Utah, and then now dealing with this movement of transfer of federal lands to states. So to remember where there's an action, there's a reaction, and now we have this added element with the Malheur occupation, with the Bundy standoff, we do have this social media reaction as well. So those are the three things, the overarching themes I want us to think through and plug in the federal land transfer management and how we manage our federal lands generally. I also want to tie in a couple of thoughts from yesterday where we were talking about the sense of place. We can't forget that this deep sense of place in the West drives our legal framework, drives how these issues move forward. And I was going through, as I was researching the federal land transfer movement in Montana specifically, and I was reading the legislative body, there's an interim legislative committee in Montana called the Environmental Quality Council. They were charged with putting together the study of transferring federal lands to the state in Montana. In so doing, they put together a report to inform the legislators. In putting together that report, I thought this was so fun. They put together a narrative and discussed how the story and narrative is so important to this movement. And in that study, they cited to Joseph Kinsey Howard's book, Montana, High, Wide, and Handsome. So John Lauk talked about the book, Montana, High, Wide, and Handsome, yesterday, and I wanted to read to you a quote from the study. See whether you think it pertains today. No, I have to find it. Back in the days of the open range, a Montana cattleman realized up close what it meant to have a local interest in a piece of earth that he neither owned nor managed. This specific cowboy was riding the range when he came upon a sheep herder camped with his flock. He told the herder to leave. The next day, the sheep herder was still there. Again, the cattleman told the lamb licker to leave the range. The herder looked up calmly at the mounted stocksman. "You own it, partner?" he asked. The cattleman admitted, "Well, no, I don't, but it's my range," he retorted, "and I want you off." The herder got up slowly, drawing a Winchester rifle from the ground as he did so. "Listen, friend," he said quietly, "I just got out of prison after shooting another son of a bitch like you, and I'd just as soon go back for shooting another." So, relating the story to Howard, who wrote this book, Montana, High, Wide, and Handsome, the cattleman said, "Looking into the barrel of that gun, you know, I realized for the first time that I didn't own that range, and by God, I didn't even have a gun on me." So, what's changed? Actually, these occupiers, they have guns on them. So that's a bit of a twist to the story. And then I wanted to go to Dan Reinemann's comments yesterday about us shifting from extraction to attraction. And I wonder, perhaps in California, in all its relevance, that may be true, but I think that Montana, especially when we look at the results of the study, we're struggling. I would say that transition is not complete. We are struggling with the internal conflicts of intensely valuing clean air, clean water, Montana's unique natural resources, yet on the other side recognizing the economic tensions that local landowners and our community at large need some economic development at the same time, and how do those square together? So that brings me to my next thought in the question of, in the study of who supports some transfer of federal lands. Sure, I think that makes a lot of sense with these long, simmering feelings toward federal land ownership, and that there's so much federal land ownership, too much in Montana. But I wouldn't equate that with the public lands transfer movement. I don't know that local people in Montana, while they would say there's too much federal land in the state, I don't know that they would support these, especially the Malheur occupation and the Bundy standoff. And I know there were questions on that as well. So what it points to me is we have this divide. We have this divide between the narrative and how that narrative is now developing. We have a divide between the narrative and the uses on the land, the people who are working on the land and have had to work through these issues for a long time. And then we have the divide between the narrative on the ground and in the courts. I originally wanted to come up and explain how the legal framework for federal land ownership and management is incredibly clear. It's developed over the century. There's constitutional authority for it, I would argue. There's very little scholarship. There aren't cases supporting that the federal land doesn't have this authority to own and manage land. So in the courts, that issue is settled. But you have this narrative developing by, we have Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, with bills at least to study the transfer of federal lands to the states. But there's an understanding that's not a legal argument. There are no legal vulnerabilities on that federal authority. What those bills are doing are pushing the narrative, so it's getting that message out there so that we're talking about it. Because what it's going to require, I would argue, is legislation, federal legislation, to implement, say, Pat's suggestion of this modest proposal. It's not a question for the courts that the federal government doesn't have this authority. It will more be a question of how would any legislation doing that, what would it look like going forward? So I just think that's really interesting to me, that disconnect between the narrative that's developing, what's happening on the ground, which is what I actually care about the most, and I want my students to understand, and then also what's happening in the courts. And I very much agree with Tate. There's a real difference between the Sagebrush Rebellion and the arguments that came from on the ground, that came from frustration locally. Those movements were very different than what we're seeing with the Malheur occupation and the Bundy standoff. So as an example, the Malheur Wildlife Refuge had just gone through, as is required, it's a national wildlife refuge. It has a single mission. We're not talking about the BLM or the Forest Service that have these multiple use missions that are very complex and I think drive these conflicts. Malheur National Wildlife Refuge has a single mission, and it was set aside to protect migratory birds, in part because of overuse. And that was established in 1908. So recently, the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge went through a planning process, an extensive planning process that took years. It was one of these collaborative processes that pulled the local people in. And so the irony to me is that this occupation happened where you had this local collaboration. It was, or I would pose, were they outsiders coming in? And so as we have this conference, as we talk about rural, local issues versus this developing narrative, how does that play out? And I think where we see the big blow-ups, it's not the local issues, it's where you have these other issues coming in and occupying a certain area. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Well, we're going to open up for questions after these great presentations. I'm sure there's many.
So, Pat, with respect to your proposal, So we heard yesterday that there was sort of a significant difference in, one could call it efficiency or profitability between state and federal land management, but obviously a significant element of that is that the states don't have to comply with the federal rules that under your proposal they would need to. So what do you see as the advantages of transferring stewardship, although not ownership, of a portion of the federal lands to the states if in fact the states need to manage to the federal standards and so they have neither the cost advantages or the regulatory flexibility that the federal government doesn't have currently?
They wouldn't be buffeted by the political wars of the Potomac Village between the different tribes. Washington, D.C. is really a tribal community, and when I was BLM director, the thing that surprised me is how much time was wasted, in my judgment, fighting about jurisdictional responsibilities. And it does seem to me that when you get out at the state level, a BLM state director in Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota works with her counterpart in the states much more easily than they do in Washington, D.C. I tried to convince Secretary Babbitt to let me stay in Salt Lake when I was director, and I promised I'd be in Washington one week a month. That was not acceptable. So I think just having it more close to the ground would make a great deal of sense. And I also think technology is going to change the way we can monitor what's going on in public lands. And the problem in Washington, I think, is very much what it was in London during the British Empire. People have a view of what's going on in the Thames, but they don't know what's going on in India or Pakistan, and people in D.C. often don't know what's going on in Utah or Wyoming.
I'm Bill Neal. I'm a retired architect from Eugene, Oregon. And I've been involved with this issue for quite a long time because I've spent all my adult life there. And there are two issues that I would like to see the panel address or at least be made clear. We keep seeing federal lands. There are basically three types of federal lands, and they are distinctly different. One whose mission is to preserve and keep for all time parks, refuges. The second group is basically encompassed in the Forest Service, a multiple use, and which is used for extraction, it's used for recreation, and all of the rest. The third type, often overlooked, is what we call O&C lands or BLM lands. These lands were designed to be used, they were at one time in private ownership actually and returned to the federal government, and they are to be managed for economic purposes, highest best use, and all of the rest. Those three distinctions I don't think have been made real clear, and Patrick will do a much better job of explaining that than I am. And Martha just touched on it very briefly. But for the large majority of people in my state hardly recognize the difference. The second issue of recognition, because I think if you don't recognize a problem, you have a hard time solving it. The second issue, which really involves this conference, is the perception of urban and rural of these federal lands. The urban group views these federal lands as a giant recreational area. It's outside of Portland, it's outside of somewhere, it's where we go on the weekend, we ski, we canoe, we hike. People who live next to and with these lands, i.e. the rural people, look at the fact that 55% of our state is in government ownership. They have a very, very different view of what this land is for and how it should be used. I don't know if this is a question or just a clarification, but I find that a very large group of people, when they talk about this, tend to lump and group and not recognize these distinctions. Thank you very much.
Can I make one observation? Last night, I sat down with Pat Williams, who was a former congressman from Montana, and rolled out my idea. And he, like Senator Mansfield, who I work for, has a really good critical mind. So he said to me with his straight eye, So, Patrick, are you doing this because you were with BLM or you're a Westerner? And I said, it was because I'm a Westerner. And when I was in BLM, I saw, if you will, the beast of the belly. There are really good people who work for BLM. There are really good people who work for Forest Service. But their hands are so tied by the Congress that has passed legislation and that then cuts their budget so they can't do what they need to do. And it seems to me that if there is a local basis at the state level, you're going to have better collaboration and management. So those three distinctions that you were making are better understood. And one of the realities that certainly Oregon has experienced, and the West, probably not this summer because we had good precipitation, but wildland fires, because of 50 years of putting them out, are going to be a very serious threat. And so we're going to need a regional kind of cooperation that is better, decisions are made better in that region than they are in Washington, D.C.
I'd like to follow, is this on? I'd like to follow up on that question briefly because I had wanted to cover that, and I really appreciate you asking it because there really are different types of federal land, and so many people don't understand that. And so when we're talking about transferring some lands to the states, I think we need to be very explicit about which types of lands and further for what purposes, because we also have different types of state lands. School trust lands in Montana are very different from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks lands. And believe you me, there are turf battles amongst even state agencies, hopefully less, but I've certainly have viewed them. And so how to get away from the turf battles of ownership and get to the real question of management and what do we want, how do we want to see those lands managed? And I think there's also some very good examples in the Blackfoot Valley specifically of how those different types of lands are managed, but with Partners for Fish and Wildlife, there's more local control and impact from the federal agencies. They have more autonomy there, and I think they're seeing, because they are embedded in the community and part of the community, they are able to make better decisions and have more community support than having it come from Washington.
My fear, and I don't know whether this is a legitimate one or not, is a lot of times, I come from Idaho, which is, okay, I won't comment about the politics of Idaho, but if you turn over the interest to the state, if they will have a wider view of, I understand you're talking about having to do, meet environmental and species and all those kinds of things. But I think there are other issues beyond that I would like to see them have a wider view in terms of the management of those lands than sometimes it gets so narrowly focused. Because I, just as an American or a Western or whatever, I think they are national lands. I don't think they are just state lands. And how do you get that wider perspective in if you turn it over to the state?
One of the things when I was at BLM got me upset was when they were doing oil and gas, they had to put up a reclamation bond. Having been in the oil and gas business as a lawyer, I said, let me see the writing on the bonds. And most of them were unenforceable. So one of the things that if the modest proposal went forward, when it was turned over to the states, they would have to place a significant bond, perhaps $1 billion, in place to make sure that they upheld the federal standards. If they didn't, they'd jeopardize the bond.
So I have two questions. First, I want to go to Pat. Would you be interested in a friendly amendment that sort of treated the administrative costs of these programs, and a Medicaid-like solution that we did with ACA, where you might actually compensate the states for doing the administrative work.
We would have the significant advantage in that we wouldn't have to deal with the insurance lobby.
Yes, there would be that. So I assume you accept that. And then secondly, related to that is we see in the area of sort of clean water where there already is delegation to state agencies, and sometimes there's a loss there in the delegation. Or you look at the Flint situation where the EPA said, well, they were going to take care of it. No, the feds were responsible. So talk a little bit about how you would overcome that. But then I wanted to ask Nicolete and Martha, this collaboration and the outside group thing. As a political scientist, that's a big warning sign. We know a lot about how outside groups are contributing to polarization around. I mean, do you see any hope in, if you were to try to have a negotiation over bringing the lands into the state control, do you see that, we saw in the poll, at least from Chris Musty, that there's a kind of resentment. He picked up, I think, in the poll, some resentment of the outside groups. Do you think that's strong enough so that you could keep them out of the negotiations if you were to try to do something like Pat's proposal?
Why don't you guys go ahead?
Yeah, so I will, just to talk briefly on collaboration and outside groups. First of all, it is a challenge, and it's a challenge for people on both sides of the ideological spectrum. Because one of the big complaints that, say, a national environmental group like American Rivers lobbies about collaborative decision-making is that they can't possibly attend meetings at all of these different places across the country. And so there is, if we are thinking about managing our resources with the interests and knowledge of the local people, there are definitely ways that you can sort of circumscribe who is allowed to participate in that collaboration. The challenge, though, and Tay brought this up, is that then whatever decision is on the table, anybody who wasn't involved in that decision can then dispute it. And so right now, there aren't really any legal mechanisms to say, okay, what this collaborative decision is the be-all, end-all. And so it is difficult to think about, okay, well, how wide would it be better then to actually incorporate these more extreme groups that might not be represented by the local population, but if we potentially had their representatives at the table, they might live with it. So it's a really challenging and thorny question, and I'm afraid I don't have a good answer.
I'll just add that, so one of the things that I mentioned in speaking in how we think about covering these stories is having compassion for the local experience and also just the individual experience. And personally, I think that in trying to understand what's going on and to really like hear people and be able to communicate that to a wider audience, there needs to be a baseline of some kind of compassion in order to actually like hear what's going on. That's just one thing that came to mind. But I think having like a strong tradition of civic engagement on the local level is really important when we think about like how these outside groups can come in and change the narrative and have negative impacts, as we saw in the community of Burns in terms of how they're dealing with these disputes. So it's sort of like preventative care, I guess, is like having this good tradition of civic engagement on a local level and have a strong sense of identity. Some of the county officials that I've spoken with say that they don't even, so there's the cooperation clause with the BLM and local counties in which like they're supposed to come together and sign an agreement that says they're going to cooperate, and a lot of counties said that they hadn't even done that, and so there's just like a baseline level of not not having cooperation there. I don't know if, Pat, you want to talk about that, but, but that was just another like preventative care measure that I think is really important when we talk about how to deal with these in a positive way.
I don't know if I'm answering your question, but one of the concerns that I have with the transfer movement and transferring certain lands it goes exactly to the issue of how they were reserved to begin with and under what agency. And so some of that, the legal framework, the cultural framework that recognizes some of these resources that are more national in nature, clean air, clean water, endangered species, and then the different missions of the agencies. If you were to transfer that, I think you'd have to be so careful in what of those missions, what of those organic acts you retain and you don't, and how do you address all these different interests with the different groups that are may want more mineral extraction with those subsurface minerals or may not. So I don't know that you could collaboratively negotiate that. I do think it's going to be a matter of legislation, and I think it's tricky. The devil will be in the details.
3 observations. David Hayes, who was the Deputy Secretary, and Secretary Babbitt negotiated what people said was the impossible negotiation, and that was the Lower Colorado. They got agreement amongst California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada only through sort of shuttle diplomacy. And I think that same thing goes on in terms of figuring out how to make an effective transfer. Second, we'd have the Shea Principle, and the Shea Principle works really well in Utah, and I think it can apply here, so that local politicians and leaders can get full credit when it's successful, and if there's a mistake or a problem, it's my fault. And so, there'll be a bad guy involved in all this, and I'll be happy to take that on. The third thing would be to get a team, and so, Bruce, I'm suggesting you be the head. Hope Eccles can be on it. Your staff, Purdy, and your undergraduate student, and Jeff. Jeff can do the technology, because I think once you begin having local or regional meetings and beginning to explain a narrative, and I do agree the narrative is very important, and I was very struck by this morning's panel about the narrative of where the Native Americans are re-educating themselves about their tradition and history. I think Westerners need to re-educate themselves about the incredible resources that we have inherited from our forefathers, and that we need to carefully think about what's the legacy that we're going to leave for our children and grandchildren. And so I think that kind of narrative through the Lane Center might be a first kind of step. And then, again, the Shea Principle would be very important.
And I want to add one thing to support your comments, Pat, and that is to look at some of the transfers or proposals to transfer some management or ownership of National Park Service lands to tribes for management or ownership. I don't know that I'm ready to make that full analogy, but if there are reasons for that being a really good idea, it's certainly something we could learn from.
My statement of bias before my question is that I'm a hunter, fisherman, and public lands politician who has spoken against transfer proposals in the Montana legislature and worked against them. But Mr. Shea, the question is for you. For me, the narrative here is, from my perspective and my digestion of it, is how can we move closer towards shared local collaborative management without perpetuating radicalism. And I think your proposal can be deemed modest, because my sense is it comes from a place of practicality. However, I would argue that many of the proponents of transfer don't come from that same place. And how can we get past that narrative of radicalism? And I think you can really see that play out. The Montana Wood Products Association, lumber companies and lumber mills came out in opposition to transfer studies, again, out of a place of practicality. Their bets were on local collaborative management. But how do we move this needle forward in a way that doesn't necessarily allow the Bundy conversation to thrive in a negative way? Thank you.
Yeah, I was the first BLM director to sue Cliven Bundy. For some reason, he doesn't send me Christmas cards or Hanukkah cards, so I obviously am not high on his list. In 1988 in Utah, we had a bastard child of Proposition 13. They were going to have Propositions A, B, and C to cut back the state tax revenue by as much as 70%. So a bipartisan group got together and formed Taxpayers for Utah. When we started in March, we took a poll, and it showed 70% of the population was in favor of Proposition A, B, and C. And Mike Leavitt, who later became governor, and I ran for governor, they just didn't understand they needed an Irish American in Mormon, Utah, so I didn't win. But we switched it so that in November, we won. The closest one was 70-30, so we'd completely flipped it. I'm a firm believer that when people get motivated and do face-to-face kind of politics, which I still think is a hallmark of Montana, when I was growing up here, that was part of being a Montanan, was having a sense of civic and state pride. And I think if we began, perhaps again through the Lane Center, to have those kind of conversations, we could overcome some of the problems. Now, I also have learned that again, growing up as a non-Mormon in the Mormon community, my strongest weapon was my tongue. And so one time when they tried to get rid of the BLM director of the Grand Staircase, a reporter called me up and said, well, what do you think of this? And I said, well, if you want the Village Idiot Choir to lead the parade, you got the right group of people. The firm I was working for at the time was quite unhappy, and we parted company about 3 months later. It doesn't do any good, I say this, and I say this to my 28 and 30-year-old sons, to get into name-calling events, and I at 68, I still find myself at times wanting to do that. If we can avoid the split that name-calling creates and go into a face-to-face discussion, in fact, my son just got through with the Utah legislature, and he asked me what I thought he should do, and I said, go to the person who is your biggest critic and take him to lunch and find out what he thinks went, right and what went wrong. And I think we need to have that kind of discussion. So after this 88 debate, I took the three leaders of the tax thing out separately. I was afraid if they were together I might get beaten up, but separately, I engaged them again in a conversation. And I think we need in America, particularly at this day of divisiveness, to learn to our opposites or to talk to our opposites.
Being here in Missoula, which has such strong ties to the wildland fire community, I wanted to touch more on Patrick's comment about fire and try to connect it with something you said, Martha, that really struck me, which was about sense of place as a driver of our legal framework in the West. So sense of place is so strongly shaped by our lived experience of the landscape, with the potential for large-scale wildfires and effects of climate change to quickly, dramatically, and perhaps extensively alter the land where it may not necessarily recover back to what we currently know it to be. I'm interested to hear what you all foresee, or perhaps what you think you're seeing now in terms of broader policy and social implications of that dissonance between sense of place and the landscape and the changes on the land. And also, maybe if you have any thoughts on the utility of explicitly using sense of place as a concept to engage citizens with these kinds of wicked problems.
So I can talk a little bit, I guess, firstly around just the role of change in the environment and how that then intersects with our legal and policy regimes. Because I think in the water world, there is very much recognition that the hydrology that most people have lived with is not going to be our hydrology moving forward. But many, for instance, I talked about for hydropower licensing, there is an explicit clause that is, as they make decisions for these 50-year licenses, they're actually not even allowed to consider climate change as they make those projections for how to manage these hydropower projects going forward. And so I think there still is, certainly in the water world, a lot of attention that needs to happen at the policy level to shift water utilities and local, the people who are more intimately using the water are, I think, much better aware of there's a changing hydrological regime and we need to change that. But at the same time, in terms of thinking about how then sense of place can play into that, I have a colleague who did her research in Appalachia and looking specifically at the reclamation of abandoned coal mines and found a really, really interesting shift in how people related to, as she called it, like remaking place, that there were these landscapes that for their entire lives had been degraded. But then as people started engaging and trying to work with their communities to make these rivers healthy places again, that she saw a really amazing shift in people's sense of place and their sense of pride and ownership in that place. And so I do think that it can be, as we see environmental change and as we see shifts in rebuilding after wildfires, that sort of community activism can be a catalyst for bringing together people around a new shared sense of place. So.
Yeah, I would echo some of those comments. I mean, I think a strong sense of place when there is a change in the community or what the identity of the place is can lead to conflict and can be a really difficult thing to navigate. But I am hearing an increasing number of stories about how coming together to observe how a particular place or a subregion is changing because of climate change, and sort of like recognizing that your neighbors are seeing the same thing, or maybe they're seeing something that you should be noticing too, and so you're learning from them. So I think those shifts that we're seeing in terms of drought and fire and climate impacts definitely can help bring these conversations to the table that might not otherwise be happening.
So I've just started teaching the law of climate change, and I'm somewhat new I'm not a scientist, and I've had to get up to speed and learn about it. And what strikes me about it is how ill-equipped our legal system is to address climate change, that we really need to think about it creatively, think outside of the box, and come at it in every different way and new ways. And one of the problems, I think, with climate change is people connecting it. It seems so large and nebulous, and bringing it home to somewhere it impacts them. I was surprised by the survey, and that I expected those people who work on the land and see it every day and have worked there for years see the changes. I'm sorry that Dave Cameron's left. I'd be curious his thoughts on that. But where there's that connection to the impact of climate, the impact of wildfire on people and where they recreate, I think that's what's going to pull them in. And that gets me to one other thought from yesterday, and the sense of place. Our conversations about place need to be inclusive. We need to be connecting more and more people and recognizing the different types of sense of place, and because it's only with those connections that we'll be able to bridge that dissonance between climate and wildfire and individuals.
We have time for about one or two more questions.
I teach seniors and first-year graduate students, and the first time I take them out in the field, I make them separate out so they're not sitting together and spend 15 minutes just sitting in the same place. And in this day and age of smartphones and screens, it's a new experience for them to experience that kind of quiet solitude. I grew up in the summertime in the Wind River Mountains, and our parents would literally let us just go off for a day or two, and that kind of solitude, I think, is something that reestablishes a sense of place, and that's something I think we need to reintroduce sooner rather than later in our educational system at kindergarten on forward.
Thank you for humoring another one. Mr. Shea, I was curious, as a Westerner and as someone who was a former member of the Clinton administration, how does one reconcile one of the things I think as a Democrat, folks on the left struggle with in this transfer discussion is its origins in the states' rights conversation that go back to abolition and segregation. And so how do you reconcile the want and worthy desire to have more local management and control with the recognition that many of the conversations we're having have ideological origins that make folks on my side of the aisle quite uncomfortable?
No, I understand, and history is a good guidebook, but it doesn't necessarily dictate the future. And I think Martha's comment and other comments yesterday about a narrative is an extremely important one. I think technology has the potential, not necessarily now the reality, to make a lot of local decisions that used to be segregated and secretly done now having to be much more transparent. And therefore the principles of Democrat with a small d are going to be applicable. And one of the things I find most frightening is the students I teach, who are basically under the age of 30, simply don't believe in the political process, and they don't believe in any power of voting. And if we begin to lose that sense of franchise and the responsibilities that it has, we really are adrift. And so I'm hoping that there can be some kind of renaissance, but that's where my comment about polling, when I saw political leaders like Mike Mansfield or Frank Church or Governor Rampton of Utah, they were real leaders, and they were not afraid of making a decision, even at the peril of losing an election. And now the politicians that I know or see are driven by polls that say, well, I remember when I ran for governor, a friend of mine from Washington came in, and he was a consultant. And so he said, I had a button-down shirt and a tie on. He says, I don't like that tie, and we'll get you another shirt. And I said, see the door? And he left, and I didn't have any further conversations with him. But I think we've become so cosmetic in our politics that the purpose of the polis to make a community decision has been lost on many people, particularly our young people.
I want to add to that. So also in response to your question, I think since we're talking so much about the land transfer movement, it's important to mention the American Lands Council, which is centered in Utah and is west-wide. It was started by a couple of county commissioners in Utah and one in Nevada, and Ken Ivory, of course, took it up, and then now Jennifer Fielder. But you had mentioned this idea of transferring the lands has very deep roots, and that's true. But also, I think that there's been a homogenization of that idea through the American Lands Council and also ALEC. So it's sort of like this nationalization of this idea, and that ideology has sort of dispersed in a way that doesn't necessarily address local issues that I wonder if maybe it did in the past.
Yeah, the Granger movement is a good example.
Yeah. Well, and as you have seen, that movement in Montana, I would argue, is not a grassroots movement. It was driven by ALEC and
ALC.
and ALC. So looking through the documents and how it came up through the legislature really came through them.
All right, we're out of time, so let's thank our panel.
Okay, just briefly, I want to give some thanks and then invite people who can stay to go to lunch. I know some people have to run off to the airport. I want to thank all of our partners at the University of Montana for their support and for bringing together some really wonderful people to this program. We really appreciate it. Stanford is very happy to work with Montana in the future, given what we've seen, and special thanks to Chris Musty, my former student. I also want to thank my own staff, Preeti, Jessica, Marika, Jeff, for the wonderful job they did on handling this. I'm not going to give a speech, even though it was in the remarks. I'm going to spare you that. That's my gift to you. But I am interested if anybody has any feedback. It's an ongoing process. We're trying to refine how the Rural West Conference should go forward. There are different models. I know from last year that when we ask for feedback, we're going to get feedback all over the map. So if I don't take your particular suggestion, don't get offended. I'm just trying to get a sense of the group overall. But if you have any thoughts or ideas, please send them on to either me or Chris, and as I think forward about what we're going to do next year. So thank you very much to everybody for attending and for a wonderful conference.